Hello everyone. Today is January 19th, 2022. Welcome to Natural Pigments Studio, and today we will talk about silver points. That is probably one of the most exciting programs we will have, and this will be unusual format for us, and if we like that very much, and if you will like how it's will look to go today, so then we probably will repeat, and we will do that not only with silver points, which because we found even more artists after when we announce with whom we will talk, and but we probably will do this even with oil colors, and so where we will invite artists for interview. And this is our first time. It will be couple probably hiccups, and so stay with us. Why the hiccups? Because we thought then we will interview four great artists, and so then we thought we will kind of cut little bit after that, and show you this interviews. So when we work every night with George, and we were cutting and cutting and cutting, and it was difficult, and I apologize to our interviewed artists because interview even shorter, and we struggle to cut every word of yours. So what we did, whole interview you can see actually on YouTube. Today will be 11 o'clock. George will put Pacific time. It will be available for everybody, and you can see whole links. But for now, what we will do, again, program will be a little bit different. We will talk about products first, then you will understand what will be available for you, because every artist whom we interview was so excited to talk about this medium. And so then at least you know what we have in store for you. And so you, like always, you can ask questions during the interview. But on the link below, we will have the all links for the interviews and for products. But guess what? Gift for you. After first three interview, we will have interview with Koo Schadler. So she will answer all your questions. So after interview, stay tuned with us. And so you can actually ask questions live. And so Koo was so kind enough from Mexico. So we are online right now with her. So she will answer all your questions. So for now, let's talk about what we have for you in our store. So we are talking about silver points, and silver points, one of the oldest medium. And when you think about silver points, you think like, this is easy. So how many metals you have, how many shades you have. So because each of them will look, Josh will right now show the second. Okay, here. So we have for you silver, pure silver, sterling silver, copper, red brass, yellow brass, bronze. This is new one for us. We didn't have bronze before, so we have aluminum, silver, nickel, lead, and you can see then actually all of them look gray. But you can see when artists will talk about tarnishing, and you will see that they tarnish all different. So like what will be silver here, and yes, thank you very much, George. So I like this. And so copper look like almost greenish. And so, and here I will show you. So this is actually gradation done with our pads. Okay, like this. So we have aluminum pad, we have bronze pad, and copper pad. And you can see, so this would be for copper, how that copper tarnish, bronze tarnish a little bit warmer, and so aluminum is very dark. So this would be the choice, and so that how it's look like on the paper too. So and again, now we have paper for the silver points, which before we didn't have. Now we have a paper. It's mostly for sketches probably, and so just to figure out how to work the silver point. So the silver point work is so for in our store what we have it's styluses. It's called stylus. So then on one side, it's a thin stylus you can put here. Okay, let me see. And just for you to see, not many people understand, and you can actually not only squeeze, but you need to what is it?
Turn it.
Turn it. Yes, thank you. George, like always, behind the camera and helping me with English. So, and on another side of that stylus, you can put wide stylus, yes. And so then that's how you can actually use for both sides. So this one. So regular our kits, they so we have just a starter kit where you can. This is great box, and so just two different styluses, and not stylus, silver points, and one stylus. This is on the sale right now. And so we have that one beginning set. So again, here's 3 styluses, and we do have sandpaper. So if you think then the edge of the silver is not sharp enough for you, so then you can sharpen this. And we include the paper. And of course, gift set, which is nice one. So I like that one the most. So we have the ground. So a little bit just to start with ground. So we have the paper, and so instruction. And on the box, you have 6 different silver points, and 3 different wool pads, and copper pad and bronze pad. Every artist today, what we interview, will talk about the grounds, and so we have several choices for you. So the most common, of course, it's traditional silver point ground, and but you can choose the easy gesso, which is absolutely our bestseller. But you can add any minerals to that, and so Koo will talk about different minerals today, so then you can absolutely use that one. And we have couple sets left from Christmas, so it's a naughty box. It's still like in beautiful boxes, yes. So not many of them, but great price again. So then, and naughty box, oh, it's even still beautiful. And so there's 4 different silver points, where the bounty has every silver point what we have, but thin ones, and so, and of course the stylus there too. So then that would be sale for today, and for probably like what we probably will end of the months. It's not much left. And so again, reminder on you ask any questions, and George and Koo will answer immediately on the chat. But stay with us until, and that will be a little bit longer. Again, we didn't expect that long, but we just could not cut more information, and it's so valuable for you. And we hope then some of you from today will start draw with silver points. Okay, let's go.
Thank you, Lauren, for joining us on this Artist Materials Advisor, this episode on silver point. What did attract you to using silver point? And it seems like that is you're doing quite a number of silver point drawings now in your art.
Yes. it's very safe to say that it is the primary medium that I utilize. I graduated from college right in the middle of the recession. I thought, I don't want to look for a job right now. This looks very scary. So I decided to go to graduate school. Again, I was very fortunate to get accepted into a great graduate program. I went to the New York Academy of Art, and a fellow student came back to my apartment one night, saw how neatly everything was laid out in the apartment, had been exposed to SILVERPOINT via a previous professor of his named John Beavers. And he said, I think this medium fits your temperament, just, gauging what your domestic environment looks like. I thought he was a bit of a jerk, but then I ended up marrying him. So he read me like a book from the get-go. So it was through another student who's now my husband, there at the academy, and exposure he'd gotten. And I find that to be kind of a recurring theme that, especially this was pre-Instagram and social media really proliferating, that SILVERPOINT was one of those things that was kind of like verbally, quietly handed from one to another, again, really evoking some of its more anachronistic qualities.
Mm-hmm. So what qualities, besides, of course, the meticulousness in SILVERPOINT, what are the qualities about SILVERPOINT that you really like in terms of both visual and just possibly the handling qualities?
I think it's such an odd paradox of a medium in that it requires such fastidiousness and such precision to create something that ends up being so ephemeral. You have to exert all this control in your draftsmanship when you're creating your drawing, and then when you're done with it, you have to kind of let it go and know that it's going to tarnish or kind of keep slowly evolving and altering in its state long after, you're done touching it. So I appreciate that there's this duality to it, that, you have control, but then you let go of control. You're creating something that looks so fleeting and delicate, but yet it's so demanding of your attention, especially in such a digital world. If anything, I've come just to appreciate it as a tool to ensure that my focus remains intact with all the digital distractions I have. And the approach to drawing to SILVERPOINT is really interesting to me because it really, there's a lot of great drawing instruction traditions that are similar to the Barg method or that revolve around cast drawings. And there are these beautiful enveloped linear foundations that then get immaculately rendered. And that's so important. But with SILVERPOINT, you can't really smudge or blur as easily. The marks are a little more permanent. So, and it's inevitable with a limited value range that things are going to kind of flatten out anyway. So I think SILVERPOINT has made cross-contour hatch marks so incredibly important to me. And I love how, because I know that the drawing may risk looking a little more flat, I try to start everything almost more like a small architectural diagram. Like all my forms are reduced to little cylinders and boxes and ovoid shapes and things like that, so that it's almost more like I'm trying to draw geometric forms and then soften them, and then that's the rendering of the drawing. And I think any drawing media or method that gets you to think about things more sculpturally, with the context of your subject as something, if it's representational or figurative, because there's absolutely gorgeous abstract SILVERPOINT drawings that are being made, but at least if it's more representational as something that's not just comprised of really perfect lines, but almost like, how do you create the optical illusion of what you're drawing as something that recedes backwards in space and comes forward into space. So the fact that, again, something that's kind of so delicate looking, actually, I think is really well tackled when you're drawing. If you're thinking sculpturally, geometrically, architectonically, I really like that too. I really, really enjoy that. And I've enjoyed that. I've noticed that more the more I keep working in the medium, if that makes sense.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's very good. And that kind of leads me to the next question, which is, and I think you've already you've inferred it, which is what are the challenges that you find in SilverPoint? Because frankly, it's not an easy medium for many people, at least certainly when you start off.
Oh yeah. Oh, I can definitely attest to that. I think when I first started making SilverPoints, they were like postcard size, and they've only expanded with time and familiarity with the medium. And I think again, I think you really articulated the challenges of the medium. It kind of I think it was Socrates who said something like, "The one thing I know is that I know nothing," and any exacting drawing media reminds you of that over and over again. So it's going into it. It's starting a drawing knowing that the drawing may not look anything like what you expect or want it to be, and it's going into the drawing knowing that you really have to kind of lend yourself over to the medium itself, that it kind of takes precedence, and it's almost like you're the conductor of an orchestra. Maybe you're not even so much the musician playing the instrument, but you're just guiding the song along, even from a distance. So you see a lot of people adopt SilverPoint and get a very startling dose of reality in terms of where their draftsmanship skills really, really are. So again, it's almost, going into it knowing that you might fall flat on your face, and being willing to kind of get yourself up and dust yourself off and start a new piece rather than let it get to you mentally.
Yeah. So one of the challenges too is, and especially in realistic drawing, is how do you deal with the tonal range? Because, like you mentioned, it does have a limited tonal range.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of your drawings seem to achieve some very dark tones, which is much more difficult to do in SilverPoint.
Yeah, a lot of it has to do with the grounder support. I think, and being willing to experiment with that, being willing to wear a bit of a mad scientist cap, I guess, before you even start the actual drawing of the drawing. For me, over the years, I've had a lot of opportunity to kind of, I don't know how to like mix and match different ingredients, bone ash, marble dust, into a traditional gesso, into just maybe some acrylic paint, into casing, just kind of pick and choose and experiment. And I think you can do things to create a ground or a gesso which yields a more ample value range than you would expect. But, I find more than anything, just being willing to go over that line over and over and over and over again is kind of the key component.
I noticed also that besides silver, I noticed that you've also used a little bit of gold points.
Yes.
How do you use that in your work? What do you see with the gold point or achieve that you necessarily can't get with the silver?
That's a great question. I use the gold point for laying in my drawings.
Okay.
So it tends to be a little warmer and a little bit lighter. And I try not to use it too much because I am conscientious of how the gold and the silver, like one will tarnish and one will not. So I don't want like an odd little patch of like untarnished metal. It's inevitable the silver will get darker and warmer than the gold, oddly enough. But the gold is, I think, much harder. So it's fainter and lighter. So again, for laying in an image, it's really, really phenomenal. And since it is harder, at least anecdotally for me, observationally, it seems to keep a really, really fine tip a lot longer. So again, the tip doesn't abrade quite so quickly. So if you do have to go in for like eyelashes or really, really, like I've done like stones on pieces of jewelry in gold, because you really can get in and like almost needle every single tiny hair and facet of a tiny gemstone into its own rendering beautifully.
What would you say about that aspect, about looking at a reproduction as opposed to seeing it, in person?
Well, photographing SilverPoint drawings is a pill. Oh my God. It's probably, I'm going to be totally honest, I absolutely hate it. And one thing I do, while I do enjoy working larger, and, again, to clarify, I've never gilded on paper. I've only gilded on panel, which for me only goes to a certain size. I've always kept it on a on a solid substrate. While I enjoy working larger in SilverPoint on paper, I do miss making silver points at a scale that I could just like scan in a cheapo desk jet or something. Because photographing them is, you're always so torn between, okay, do I keep the light low enough to show that I have been able to achieve, a more ample value range than anticipated? Or do I want the beautiful, like warm white background of this gesso that I've labored over? You're being pulled between all these different priorities, and it's so incredibly difficult to choose which one to prioritize. So I've played with the idea. I haven't yet looked into it, of having my drawings professionally scanned using a large format scanner. But honestly, I think that is one, no pun intended, one silver lining of social media, is that you can do things like create little videos of light falling across the piece that do a really, really great job of illustrating how the piece kind of like shimmers and evolves just during the day. So, any chance I can to have studio visits rather than just send me a photo, I really jump at, because it really makes, and that's the comment you hear from that I'm sure all the other artists you're interviewing will say, when people see a silver point in person, they react to it with such surprise and even a bit of like an infantile delight, versus just seeing a photo of it. They really don't photograph.
Well, thank you, Mike, for joining us on this episode of Artist Materials Advisor. We're talking about SilverPoint and this ancient medium and how it's used today in contemporary art. And so I want to welcome you, Mike, to this session.
Thank you. You're welcome.
And can you tell us a little bit, give us a little bit background, how you started in art and what's the main focus of your art today?
Sure. After college, I had a career in the Air Force, and so I came to art making kind of later in my life. When I started making art, I gravitated to painting, and a friend of mine told me that I should look into encaustic paint. I didn't know very much about it. He didn't know very much about it, but my search led me eventually to the Fayum mummy portraits at the Metropolitan Museum in New York City. And I was hooked after that. I was just fascinated by them, and I wanted to learn everything I could. And so I started on about a 2-decade-long journey learning about encaustic paint and making realistic landscapes with encaustic paint. And along the way, I wanted to do it the way the Romans did it, with natural earth pigments. And so that led me to natural pigments. And that's where I got my pigments to paint with. And while I was on your site one day, I came across an article, I think it was an article about SilverPoint drawing. And it was something that I had heard about, but really didn't know anything about again. And so it sent me off on another tangent, and I started doing research about SilverPoint drawing. And that led me to doing a lot of experimentation with different kind of grounds and things. And so that's what got me into the drawing part of it.
So I noticed you do a lot of different work you've worked in different medium oils, and I noticed some work in egg tempera. Is most of your work in which you mentioned encaustic, is would you say most of your work is encaustic medium?
Well, that's a good question. For the past 20 years or so, I've been pretty much an encaustic painter. Spread in between there's been some oil painting and egg tempera painting. I've drawn all along with different things, but just kind of recently I started really getting excited about metal point drawings. Mostly silver and gold, but I've done a few other things. And so I have a show coming up in March that will be just silver point drawings.
Oh, okay.
Actually, metal point drawings. There's a few gold drawings in there
Sure.
too. And so for the last 3 years, that's been my focus is metal point drawing.
Oh, okay. I
Yeah,
see.
but
So what
yeah.
what are some of the things that you like about silver point as opposed to, for instance, other types of drawing medium like charcoal and graphite?
Yeah. The very first thing that really caught my eye about metal point drawing was looking at Michelangelo's drawings. I saw a show that had several of his drawings in it, and while they're nothing like my drawings, they fascinated me with how delicate the line was, and how I like how it tarnishes. I think that's pretty cool. The silver, and they have such a different look, a different feel than graphite or charcoal. They feel kind of, in a way, special to me. And so that line of Michelangelo's is what really got me going about it. And while I don't draw with a lot of line, I draw with a lot of shading and tonality, but that's what first got me excited about it. Yeah.
Oh, great. What are some of the challenges you find with silver point?
Well, it's very slow. And I like to get heavy shading with it. And so that takes a lot of time, a lot of patience. So when I'm drawing, I will take breaks in between and do smaller drawings or small doodles, sketches in between, getting ready for paintings and things like that. And then just keep going back to it. When I'm working on a larger silver point drawing, I'll leave it out in my studio, and so that I can look at it all the time, and then just pick the tools up and draw with it at any time. I'm not a plein air kind of person. I like my studio, so it works well for me. I'm in my studio a lot, and I can then just sit. But the time that it takes to draw with metal point is certainly a challenge for me. It made me have to slow down, which was probably a good thing. So yeah, that's definitely the biggest challenge for me. I really like the process of preparing the ground, preparing the surfaces to work on. I like drawing on paper rather than hard surfaces. I've done both, but I like the paper much better. I like finding different kinds of papers. Right now, I really like twin rocker paper.
How do you protect the final drawing? Framing, glass? What are some of the things that you do for that?
Yeah, well, I always mat them with conservation mats, and then put them under glass and frame them.
Okay.
Yeah,
Great.
I've experimented with a few sprays to seal the drawings, but I've never gotten the courage to spray a final drawing yet with one of them. It seems like every time I use a spray of some sort, it changes the surface a little bit, and so I just don't want to do that.
Right. You mentioned, of course, you worked in, besides silver point, what other metals have you worked in, and can you talk a little bit about what are some of the things that you like about these different metals?
Sure. I've used gold quite a bit. I really like gold. Gold is smoother than silver, and you can get darker darks with gold than with silver.
Which
but
most
I like
people
the
think
way
is counterintuitive because they're thinking of the color gold as opposed to the light
Right.
it makes.
Right. Yeah. You don't see the gold at all.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is really kind of funny, and it's kind of curious why you don't. Yeah. Um, the gold, of course, doesn't tarnish, and so as the one thing that I like about the silver is that the silver does tarnish, and it just gives it a very nice patina and makes the drawing look cool.
Sure.
It makes it look neat over time, yeah. So silver and gold, those are my two main ones. I've used copper. Copper is fun, but it's harder and it's a little more difficult to control. And then it gets a kind of that greenish tint to it as it ages, and I don't really care for that too much. I've used steel wool, and steel itself, soft steel. Those are nice, but again, much harder than silver or gold, and so it's a little more difficult to use. And I've done one drawing with lead.
Oh, okay.
It turned out nice, but it kind of scared me working with it. I just don't think I need to worry about the poisoning part of lead. So
yeah, sure.
So I put that away.
Sure. What would you? So we have, of course, there's going to be a lot of artists who have never done silver point before who may be watching this. And what would you? What advice would you give them, or what would you tell them starting off in silver point?
If you're drawing with graphite or charcoal, both of those mediums have their drawbacks in that they can be messy. There's a lot of technical things, especially with graphite, and that you need to understand the hardness of the lead that you're using, what kind of paper you're drawing on. There's a lot of things with graphite that I find much more challenging than I do with silver point. With silver point, getting the ground correct is the hardest part, but it's really not that hard. I mean, it's really a pretty simple thing to do, and you can put a ground on just about any surface. And then you have one tool, and that's your silver tip or your gold tip. And so it's really very easy to get started with. It's kind of the simplest form of drawing, really, except for the ground. You can't draw directly onto paper. It won't make any mark at all on a plain sheet of paper. But putting that ground down is just similar to putting a ground on a canvas for painting too. So it's not that big a deal, really.
Great. Okay. Michael, I want to thank you for joining us on this episode of the Artist Materials Advisor. And of course, we look forward to having you back again, in which case we'll be talking about encaustics.
Thank you very much, George. I appreciate it.
Great. Well, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Erin, for joining us on this episode of the Artist Materials Advisor. And we're going to be talking about, of course, silver point. But before we do that, I'd like to know a little bit more about how you started in art. What were the motivations or that helped you go into art?
Well, my background was an undergrad in art history, and I think I realized as I was doing the degree that my interest in the materials was I actually wanted to be making the paintings more than just studying it. But going to school in the early 90s, I didn't have a lot of, there wasn't a lot of traditional mediums being taught where I was going to school. So I finished that up, and then I ended up going into illustration, just kind of self-taught, writing and illustrating children's books. I was always more interested in figurative art. And I think my dream was always to go back and learn egg tempera. And then at some point I just decided that was what I was going to do. So I took it first as just, this is going to be this side fun thing that I do on on my free time. And, but then realized that that's actually what I wanted to do full time. So for the last few years, that's what I've been doing.
Do you build up all the tonal values that you anticipate in the painting through the silver point?
I do. Yeah, I fully render it, and then I go and I do just tones with egg tempera, usually like a sienna or umber, and do the green, and then start building up colors after that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Oh, great. So what qualities of silver point did you like as a drawing medium? What attracted you to that?
Um, for me, it's very ethereal. Like I love, what I love about the silver is when it's left and it just sort of, tarnishes, and it's almost like a tone on tone.
Mm-hmm.
And when I'm drawing with it, even on the egg tempera panels, when I know it's going to be covered, that sort of shimmer that you get, when you put it in the light, and it, I don't know, it's like a little bit of magic. And I also like that. I mean, I think part of why you use it is that it doesn't come off into the pigments when I'm adding the pigments on, which, initially that seemed to make a lot of sense. I don't have to worry about any kind of oil in the pencil or any of that coming off into the pigments. So that was sort of my initial, and I think a lot of people are intimidated because you can't erase it, or you think you can't erase it. But I don't know, that's not been a huge problem. I tend to work out composition prior to doing a render drawing in Silverpoint anyway. So if there's few things that need to change, you can kind of fiddle with it and make it work. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
So do you, what are the challenges you found in, you mentioned, of course, what most people find is challenging is the fact that there's no erasure, but was that the only challenge that you found? And you said that wasn't as big of a challenge for you. What challenge did you find in learning and
I think
developing?
for me, the biggest challenge has been finding a ground to use when it's not on an egg temper panel. I've the last year been trying to I did like a series of drawings for a show, and I also used some objects and other things, and so I needed a ground to put on paper. I haven't found the perfect ground. I love the traditional ground because of the texture and because it's close to, an original old-fashioned gesso. But the way I've been doing the drawings is kind of like how I work in egg tempera, which is I do a fully rendered drawing, and then I'll actually scumble it out, and I'll draw again on top of it. And so you get a little bit of the layering, and it's a much softer look than just, say, one layer of a drawing. And what I found is if I use the traditional ground on the lower layers, I can sometimes, too often, completely erase the drawing when I put a scumble on it. And so I've tried acrylic rounds and using that on the under layers, and then just using a traditional ground on the top, because I don't really like to paint with acrylic. I don't like using plastic, but it does seem to keep the drawing a little better when I'm trying to do that layering. And I don't think I don't know honestly, I don't even know how most people do their silver point. Maybe the layering is just me being stupid or quirky. But so getting that to work has been a challenge. And I feel like I'm getting it. I feel like I'm slowly experimenting my way into getting that technique to not be a disaster every other time.
Right. What kind of supports do you like to work on for Silverpoint?
Well, for Silverpoint, I've been the one I love the most is just a traditional gesso board. I've been using icon panels for paintings, and that's what I like to draw on the best. The texture is just unbeatable. But I've been experimenting, like I said, with hot and cold. I think a smooth paper is a little bit lusher and nicer. It's been taking the ground a little bit better. But I've been experimenting on all kinds of, I did a resin cast of a lion skull and did it on there, and just trying to see what else it might work on that is maybe less traditional. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. You did. I saw one piece you've done. It's it was, if I believe it was an egg.
Oh
And
yeah, it was an
yeah,
ostrich egg.
what was the what was that? Was that a ceramic egg or was that a wood or some other?
Yeah, it was an ostrich egg.
Oh,
And
really?
so, yeah, and I played around with chicken eggs, and you could put the silver point directly on a chicken egg, and it
Mhm.
take the silver. So I was like, oh, I'll try this, but not an ostrich egg. It didn't work. So I ended up covering that with layers of ground. And again,
Mhm.
I initially used an acrylic ground and then covered it with the more traditional for a few more layers before
Yeah.
I worked on it. Yeah.
Oh, great. So uh, what other metal points or metals have you done any experimentation besides, of course, the silver? Have you worked with any other metals in your drawings?
I've worked with gold.
Hmm.
It I I've seen it done where you can really see the difference. I know Koo has a class, and they would like to take it because she has, I think, perfected like everything her technique. Um, but I did not find the way that I'm using it there to be a huge difference, and I missed having the tarnishing that happens with the
Hmm.
silver. Um, I I like that look, and I like once it gets that sort of golden hue that the gold really never got that.
Hmm.
So I went back to silver.
If you were to advise a beginning art or an artist that wanted to start in silver point, what would you advise them? How would you what's the best tips that you would have to help them get started and really get up to speed as soon as possible? Because it does take time.
I would say just to dive in and not be precious about it.
Hmm.
I that's anything is just assume that it's not all going to work and just take it as a lesson of how you like to work and not worry too much about um, being perfect or following the perfect from the beginning. I
Hmm.
think I would say that it's much easier to just, get yourself a little stylus and get a decent one in the beginning.
Hmm.
I think when I first was experimenting, I picked up some cheap stylus on like Amazon or something, and it's too fat. It doesn't really work, and they're really not that expensive. So just get a good stylus and get a couple, pieces of decent silver. And if you're intimidated by the grounds, Golden has one that's really easy to slap on and experiment with. The traditional ground, I was very intimidated by because it's kind of like a baking lesson in how to get the gel to form and all that. So
Hmm.
if that's stopping you from doing it, then just get a cheap ground to play with, and
Sure.
and then and don't wait too long because the real ground is nice to work with.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I mean, I was just putting it on scraps of paper, and try find what works for you, because I know when I was reading, people like different things: hot press, cold press, whatever. And yeah, don't be precious.
That's good advice. Yeah, because that's true for anything that we need to start on. Just put your both feet in and just get going. Thank you, Erin, for joining us on this episode and for sharing your artwork with us and telling us a little bit about what you're doing in regards to Silver Point. Really appreciate that.
Anytime. Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. Thank you. Welcome, Koo, to this episode of the Art Materials Advisor. We're going to be talking exclusively about Silver Point, and thank you for joining us.
Thank
today.
you for having me. Yeah,
It's our pleasure. And you and I have known each other for quite a long time, actually. I think it was the late 90s. I met you at a Tempera Society meeting. And of course, at that time, I was starting my interest in tempera. And so can you explain, how did you get interested in, and I know some of how you got interested, how you started in tempera. Maybe you can explain a little bit about that, and then how you started in SilverPoint.
Well, I was an art history major in college. I didn't study studio art, but I always wanted to be a painter. So I tried off and on throughout my 20s into my early 30s, lived in Florence. I was an art furniture maker for a while, did a lot of different creative things. But eventually, in the early 90s, I took a history of painting class taught by Chester Arnold. He's a wonderful painter. And we did a different medium every week. We did encaustic and fresco. And the week we did egg tempera, something resonated with me, and Chester recognized that. And he said, "You're going to be an egg tempera painter." I didn't know what he meant, but he was right. But I spent the next several years in the early 90s studying classical oil painting with a husband-wife couple, Numael and Shirley Politos, wonderful painters. And I went back and forth between oil and egg tempera, but I finally chose egg tempera as my primary medium. And it was Shirley Polito who, several years later in the early 2000s, knowing that I loved egg tempera, said to me, "I think you would like SilverPoint." And I said, "What SilverPoint?" I'd never even heard of it. So I went out and I bought a piece of silver jewelry wire, and I stuck it in a dowel, and I just started drawing my true gesso panels that I use for egg tempera. And that was it. I fell in love with it the way I fell in love with egg tempera.
Well, thank you. So what aspects of SilverPoint do you like? What are the qualities of SilverPoint that make it useful as a drawing medium?
Well, there's so many. I always think of, there's a quote from the movie Lawrence of Arabia, where a reporter asks, "What is it, Major Lawrence, that attracts you personally to the desert?" And Lawrence answers, "It's clean." And I always like that idea with metal point. There's something clean and precise and careful and elegant about it. There's an instructor at the Pennsylvania Academy, Jill Rupinski, and she calls SilverPoint the gourmet of line drawing. And I really like that quote. Thanks to Daryl Babatunde Smith for that quote. It really sums up so much about metal point, SilverPoint drawing. I also like that it's a quiet, meditative medium that you have to develop over time. It gradually emerges, and it's akin to egg tempera in that way.
Yeah.
So there's a patience, there's a focus, there's a quietness, there's a peacefulness about it. So I love that aspect of it. And finally, as you know, George, I love craft and science in art. And Metal Point gives so many opportunities for that because there's so many different supports and grounds. It's really an incredibly creative medium. So I love that part too.
So what are the challenges you find in working in SilverPoint?
Well, I'd first like to address what I think is one of the, it's not a misconception. I think it's a little overplayed, and that's that a lot of people say the big challenge in Metal Point is that it can't be erased. And it's true that it's not as amenable to erasing as graphite or charcoal. But in fact, there's ways to get around that. I say that because I don't want beginners to feel discouraged by the requisite draftsmanship. There's a wonderful drawing by Durr, the artist Durr, in the early 1500s of it's called Dog Resting. And they've looked at it under certain lights. I don't know what the, experiment they run on it, where they can see the charcoal drawing that underlies the SilverPoint dog. So Durr went in with an erasable medium charcoal, roughed in the dog, and then drew SilverPoint on top of that. And there are little ways you can erase on certain grounds that are built up in multiple layers, or you can sand. And so do you need good draftsmanship? Absolutely. But I don't want people to feel they have to have flawless, impeccable draftsmanship. There are ways to work around that. I think that the challenge of any medium, the most important thing is to love and be drawn to your medium. And then that kind of fascination and love pulls you through the inevitable challenges that becoming good at any medium is going to pose for you. So you have to make sure it really suits your nature and suits your visual goals as a painter. And then I think it will pull you through the learning curve and the challenges. There is a certain amount of craft involved, I think, in understanding the ground. And the more that you understand and can manage the ground, the more success you'll have in drawing and be able to achieve your goals. So you do have to apply a little bit of, understanding the ground and coming up with the ground that best suits what you're trying to achieve. So those are some things to consider.
And you've done quite a number of experiments with different types of grounds. And can you talk us through some of those things?
Sure. I like a lot of silver point artists are challenged by is the limited value range. There's a peacefulness, there's a beauty to that limited value range. But on the other hand, something exciting in painting is a full range of values, or in drawing too. So a lot of metal point artists try to figure out, how do I extract more values from this medium where you're mostly in, the light to mid dark gray zone. So I've done a lot of playing around with adding things to grounds to increase the abrasion. You sent me many different things to try. I dug up a bunch of my own: bone ash, silica, pumice, barite, all sorts of different, white fillers. And tried them out in a lot of different, adding them to a variety of binders. I've tried oil binder, egg tempera, egg as a binder, gouache, gum arabic, casein, you name it. And that's what I mean about the creativity of metal point. If you can just raise the pigment load in a binder sufficiently to create a rough, irregular, toothy surface, and then if you make sure that that pigment load has a certain amount of hardness to it, so for example, titanium, pumice, silica, they're all in the 6 to 7 on the Mohs hardness scale, whereas most metal nibs are about a 2 to a 3, you're going to get abrasion. So playing with the different binders, playing with how much pigment I can add to the binder and still make it viable, a strong ground. And then adding the solids that will increase the hardness. So you don't have just tooth, but you have hardness. Tooth plus hardness is really the secret to a good metal point ground.
Right. And just for our audience that don't know what Mohs hardness, it's a measurement of mineral hardness, and it's a scale that goes from 1 to 10, 1 being, I believe it was soapstone or some form of talc.
Sometimes.
And then the hardest is, of course, diamonds.
Correct.
And so that's an important, because in addition to the minerals having hardness, of course, the metals have their own hardness, most of them being very soft.
Right. Well, let me just say, George, speaking of the number 10 diamond, that you can buy diamond dust. Mm-hmm. And so I am going to try this in the spring. I'm going to buy a small quantity of diamond dust and add it to a ground and just see what happens. Yeah, well, that would be worthwhile experimenting. And sure. I know you've done experiments with things like pumice, which is a silicate, and what is the other thing I know you've discovered is how the ground affects the color of the metal or the deposit. Right. Yeah, it's remarkable. And I would hate to say I discovered it, because I know plenty of other experienced silver point artists have experienced this too, noting that metals tarnish differently depending on the ground. And I have done a series of ground tarnishing experiments where I took, I think it was 7 different metal nibs, and I applied them to, I believe, 8 different grounds, including plike paper, a black gesso, and then a bunch of other homemade and pre-prepared grounds for metal point. And then I exposed them to different tarnishing elements. Apple cider vinegar, very acidic, liver of sulfur, and then also garlic and onions. And the reason I know that garlic and onions affect the drawing is my husband, he's retired now, but he was a vegetable farmer. And whenever he harvested the garlic or onions in the adjoining building, my drawings would tarnish much more quickly. So I took, yeah, it was wow, this is really making
That's
a difference.
interesting.
Yeah. So I took these various sample panels with these different nib marks and grounds, and I exposed them to these elements for anywhere from 24 to 36, then 72 hours. And it was just remarkable how differently all the nibs colored depending on the ground. You would think the copper would look the same, it'd only be changed by the tarnishing element, but no, it was also affected by the ground for sure. And then the really illuminating thing was that after 72 hours, I would say maybe 40% of all marks completely disappeared. Because what a lot of people, obviously one of the things that people love about metal point is that the drawing tarnishes. It takes on a life of its own once you're done with it. It's exposed to elements and it changes color, and it mostly deepens in value. And so people love this magical, mysterious alchemy that takes place when they're done with the drawing. But it's important for artists to realize that tarnishing is a reaction to corrosive materials, attacking the metal. And if you overdo it with tarnishing, you will degrade the metal deposits on the drawing to the point where they fall off, and your drawing will disappear. Or, as you and I have talked about, zinc, if you expose it to a zinc metal point mark, if you expose it to certain tarnishing elements, can transition to white. And so you may not lose the particles, but they're no longer, visible on a white ground. So tarnishing is wonderful, but you do have to approach it with that understanding and a certain amount of caution.
Right. Yeah, that's a very important consideration, and because I know a lot of silver point artists are experimenting with tarnishing. Of course, the most common one is liver of sulfur, but some of those results may be totally unexpected and usually pretty uneven. I think you found that also.
Absolutely. Yeah, you can have a copper point. Copper will tarnish to different colors depending on what the element is in the atmosphere. It can turn green or blue or a dirty brown. And you may have a part of the drawing that gets a spot of nice, rich green in the copper and then nowhere else. And there's something magical about the lack of control, and the drawing seems to have a mind of its own. But it can also be problematic at times, for sure.
Right. Well, how do you mount or protect your silver point drawings once they're completed?
Yeah, it's a tricky question because metal point drawings are vulnerable. As we've talked about, they're vulnerable to tarnishing. They're also on this absorbent, irregular surface that can, things can attach to it. They can get dirty and the dust embed in that irregular surface. So they really do need to be protected. And what I mostly do is I frame under museum glass, but I don't really like artwork under glass. I like the immediacy, the physicality of a work of art. So I'm experimenting with varnishing metal point drawings. And as you and I have discussed in length, varnishing mediums that have these very irregular, porous, open surfaces, these high pigment volume concentrate surfaces like egg temper or metal point, is complicated because the initial varnish layer pretty much becomes part of the work of art. It adheres in a way that it's not readily removable. So I understand it's complicated. There are pros and cons to every option, but I'm basically trying to figure out how to varnish them akin to how I varnish my egg temper paintings, because I like that layer of protection that still allows the drawing to be so immediate and present and not behind glass.
So, Koo, can you explain what you did with this one image with the girl and has a cap? Looks like really wonderful amount of texture going on in this particular drawing.
Yeah. Well, what I did in that drawing, that was a lot of fun. I worked with the Rublev temper ground as my ground, few additives to it to further increase the abrasion. And then I tinted it with a variety of colors. Something that's sort of fun to do is to think about ground like paint. And you can essentially paint with ground if you tint it different colors. And so I developed somewhat variation of color to get the sky and a bit of the landscape. And then I started working up my metal point drawing, but I wasn't getting enough from it. I wasn't getting enough depth of value or variety or atmosphere. So what I did is I took the original blue tinted temper ground and I thinned it, and I applied what I call a scumble, a very thin, transparent layer of the white over the whole drawing. I do this in my egg temper classes to my students all the time, where I scumble over, or they scumble over their images, and there's a moment of, what am I doing? I've worked so hard to build up this image, and now I'm covering it. But if the layer's thin enough, like a veil or a mist, it injects a bit of atmosphere. It unifies disparate marks. And in the case of metal point, it reinstates the ground. So once again, you're back to some of the original abrasion, so you can start building up your darks again. So I tried that, and it worked well. So then I tried it again, and I did it again, and I probably developed that drawing, knocked it back with a scumble of ground, developed it back and forth, 8 or 10, I lost track of how many times I scumbled over that with ground. And the end result was it gave it more atmosphere than I can sometimes get from my other metal point drawings, where it's just the metal mark, which I love, but I like all this variety too. So that gives, I feel, that drawing a little more atmosphere because of all that layering of scumbles.
Can you explain what you did with this image of the rabbit? And it appears, of course, it's on paper with a gold leaf background, apparently, of course, on a wood panel.
Yep. So I did that drawing on, it's a handmade paper, a well-known company called Twin Rocker. It was a 320-pound, gorgeous, handmade, deckled edge paper. And when I finished the drawing, I floated it on a panel that I'd gold leafed, and it's raised about, I think 1/8 of an inch above the panel. There's a backing behind it, so it really looks like it floats above the gold. And the drawing itself was similar to the lily and landscape drawing, in which I started by developing a ground of different colors that would begin to, convey the sky versus the landscape. And built up layer after layer, did some scumbling. But what was a fun technique in that image was the brocade behind the rabbit. I rubbed some copper wool over the area where the brocade was to go. And then I placed down a commercial stencil. There's just fabulous stencils available now. And I took ground and I sponged on ground, to create the stencil pattern. And then I again rubbed copper wool over that stenciled on ground pattern. And then I, did that over and over with a couple of different stencils just to get that richness of layering. So yet again, another fun tool. Our stencils can be used to apply grounds and create different textures or patterns that you can then draw on top of with metal point. So lots of fun things that you can do.
Yeah, a lot of very interesting textures and patterns going on. It looks really nice.
Yeah, layering. Egg temper prepares you for infinite layering. And the same can be applied to metal point. It's also lovely to do a quick sketch in metal point. I'm not saying it's required, but for those of us who love to layer, metal point has that same potential, and it can yield some really wonderful atmospheric, rich results for sure.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you. So was there anything else that we should mention?
Yeah. I want to say one more thing to beginners because, I teach a lot of workshops, and what I run into often are people who are understandably very eager to get better, and it's, it takes time. And so I really want to encourage people, because metal point is a medium that takes time both to acquire knowledge of the craft and the skill, but also just for the image to emerge. And, sometimes if people don't see results right away, they feel like they're doing something wrong, or it's me, or it's the medium, and it might not be either. These things just take time, and there's a wonderful Michelangelo quote, "Genius is eternal patience." So for beginners, what I always say is give yourself time to get good. Just, get lost in the process and give yourself time.
Right. And that's so true for so many traditional mediums.
Yes,
true for
exactly.
tempera. I know it's for fresco. Very true. And a lot of people work at it for hours and then go, well, nothing's happening.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
it will.
And you just be patient. be patient.
Yeah,
Hang in there.
patience is a big part of that.
Yeah, for sure.
And that seems to be more and more difficult to do these days.
I
And
think so.
even with artists.
And in fact, it's a good antidote. That's one of the reasons I value these mediums, because it is a good antidote to the rush and lack of patience we're all experiencing these days, is to get lost in these mediums and have faith and trust in the results if you hang in there.
Right. Very good. Well, thank you, Koo, for taking the time to talk to us and share some of your experiences with SilverPoint and your artwork and the really incredible variety of things that can be done that you've shown us, not just, this black and white drawing, but even incorporating with color.
Yeah, well, my pleasure, as always. I'm so grateful to you and Tanya for your support of traditional mediums and traditional artists, and for sharing this knowledge with others, because I know there are so many artists who love these traditional ways of working. So it's a joy to share it with others. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
So for those of you who survived for a whole hour, and so we have a gift for you. We have Koo today online. And while George will figure out how to put two of us together. Oh, hi, Koo.
Hey. Hi.
So
great to see
glad
everybody.
to see you. So yes. So looks like based on response, we did very well today. So everybody's so excited, and so thank you very much being friend with George for so many years, and I can tell you that yes, George has 4 artists. Living artist.
Tanya, excuse me, I'm going to move. I think my Wi-Fi is a little weak. I'm going to reestablish the signal. Hi, everybody. Yes. I'm sorry, but I have to get closer to my router, and then I'll get back where it's...
Good. We can see you. Oh, okay.
Nope, she froze.
Yes. So
she's coming. She's in Mexico, and she's broadcasting from there.
So great.
So we'll...
I hope that reestablished it. Sorry.
Oops.
We lost her.
Okay.
So she can just dial back in. In the meanwhile,
so like
there was...
one second I mentioned, so then Koo is one of this artists who George absolutely adore, and
sorry.
There she is.
So for her absolute knowledge and how she approaches every painting of her, and so how much she learned every time. And so in fact she was Koo, you went twice to our classes, yes? And
yeah, I took the painting best practices twice. I want to take it again. I'd take it about 10 more times if I could, but fantastic class. And I love pushing George on the egg tempera end of it, because I know it tends to, oil tends to predominate in the room. So somebody's got to speak up for egg tempera for sure.
Yes.
And
you are the one who pushes him for sure. So, and he loves push people.
I like to get pushed around.
Yes. Just because I saw a couple questions about, so I just want to mention, and Koo, thank you very much for mentioning this. I completely forgot, and of course our son will kill me if I will not say that. So here's tempera panels. And so it's very easy way to start to draw, because it's an aluminum panel, and this is with tempera ground already, so it's very easy to start. If you don't like the paper, so then this is of course what we have already prepared for you, or you can do like what Koo does. So she's using our tempera ground, and looks like she's editing something else there, and so then let's go. We have a couple questions.
I'm going to start with this question. Oops, let me see.
Oh, we can see that. Yep. Okay.
I'm going to put that on let me just put this on a white background for some reason.
We had a lot of questions for you, and
I actually saw that question earlier. If you want me to jump in,
yes, please. Yes, please.
Yeah, it's by a really good SilverPoint artist, Lori. Hi, Lori. does the patina occur over time? Is it faster with the liver of sulfur? The same. So liver of sulfur, you can buy it in a jar, and you can put it. A craft supplier sell it and put it in a little open container, and the fumes will expose the drawing and speed up the tarnishing. Is it as fast as when a drawing is just exposed to the elements? Well, it really varies what elements you're exposed to. Another, Margaret Krug, she does silver point drawings in Italy near Sulphur Springs. Sure, that will be pretty fast tarnishing. If your husband has a garlic and onion business next door, that will speed up tarnishing. So it really depends. If the liver of sulfur is going to be faster than your environment, it depends what your environment is. But as I said in the interview, don't try to speed it up too much, because you just can pay a price for that, because it will be the beginning of the degradation of the metal point marks. So yeah, there you go.
There's another question, and there's a couple of questions on varnishing metal point. Could you talk to us about that?
Sure. I saw one earlier about what do I use to varnish, and George and I have had this conversation for a couple of decades now about how to varnish egg tempera paintings, and it's been quite a learning process for me. And what happens is egg tempera and metal points have this characteristic called high pigment volume concentrate. And what it means is there's a very high percentage of pigments relative to the binder in egg tempera paint and in metal point within the ground. And it's that very high pigment load. It's so high, in fact, that the pigment particles protrude above the surface of the binder. And that's what creates that microscopically irregular rough surface in egg tempera for the paint to latch onto, and in metal point to abrade the metal nib, and also for the metal deposits to latch onto. And so to smooth the surface, the metal deposits won't adhere as well. So when you're varnishing these surface, the problem that arises is the varnish also attaches very well to that high PVC irregular surface. And it's probably not something that's going to come off a varnish on an egg tempera painting, on a metal point drawing. So what you do is you first isolate the image, and what you hope to achieve is a thin, non-yellowing, kind of inconsequential layer that more or less fills in the high PVC and separates the artwork from the varnish you apply on top of the isolating layer. It's a complicated subject. I've written extensively about it. George talks about it. So that's enough of introduction. But what do I use for an isolating layer? I use shellac, and the conservators don't like that I do that. I could go into the pros and cons. There's a lot of synthetic materials you can use. I'm playing with B72. George, Natural Pigments supplies a version of B72 in solution already. What's that one called? Is
that polymeric?
Yeah,
polymeric varnish.
Yeah, it's the Conservar polymeric varnish. That's the Paraloid B72.
Correct. So you can isolate with those, and then you put the varnish on top. I see in the comments section that I do use shellac, but I just want to clarify that conservators find that problematic. And if you want to, understand why, you can read my book or write me about it. I don't want to take up too much time with that. So I haven't done a lot of varnishing of metal points. I'm playing with that idea. And does it affect the shine? Yeah, it changes the shine for sure. And you lose that part of it. And the one thing I've learned after all this time is every material, every working method gives something and takes something. And it's important to protect a metal point drawing, and glazing under, using a frame and glass is problematic, and varnishing has some problems too. You definitely give something up.
For me, it was surprised to see zinc on your chart.
Yeah, wasn't that?
I actually, first I didn't even understand when I saw that first, and I thought like, okay, she mentioned zinc, but she didn't put anything.
Mm-hmm.
And
no, I did. It got eaten away. I also noticed in the comment section something about wax. And yes, you can wax a drawing, but I think you could run into a lot of problems if you wax it without isolating it first, because wax, the fact that it's a paste, you've got to rub it on. I think you could
degrade or lift or smear, so to speak, metal point particles, deposits. So I would isolate, and then I have done that, isolated with shellac or B72, and then put a wax medium varnish on top. And it's a lovely finish. It's a gorgeous finish for sure. So that works too.
Thank you.
I'm going to add this one comment from another comment from Lori about making darker marks.
Well, boy, how long do we have?
It's okay.
Okay. So the key to dark marks is there's several things. And of course, everyone knows about, my little toothiness that I've talked about in the high PVC ground that creates abrasion. And think of it as microscopic sandpaper. You need that to abrade the metal nib, to rub off little particles, deposits of metal that create a line. But the other part of that is hardness. It's not just, because imagine if you had this toothy surface, but it was made of, cotton or talc. If it was soft, that metal nib would just wear it right down. So in addition to the tooth, you need that tooth to be harder than the metal nib. And George mentioned the Mohs, M-O-H-S, hardness scale, named after the man who figured it out. And most, it's a scale of 1 to 10, and most metal nibs are, lead is a 1, tin is a 1, pewter and bismuth are 2s, silvers and golds are 3s, something like that. You get nothing higher than about a 3.5 for most metal points. So, and then most fillers that we would use in a ground are higher than that. Zinc is, I think, a 4, and titanium, I think, a 6. But what if you start doing things like pumice, which is a 6.5, I think, or silica, 7. So, the more of tooth you have and the harder that tooth, the more it will abrade the nib. So what do I add, Lori? My two favorite go-to are pigment additives are silica and pumice. And I like them in part because of my testing, which is admittedly all limited. I'm just one artist trying to mostly paint and draw, but they also brought out extra color in the nib. As another artist was saying, that it's strange how you can have a gold point that looks like beautiful shiny gold, but when you draw with it, it's just a dull gray. And why that is because a solid piece of metal is very continuous and reflects light very continuously, but when you break it into a gazillion tiny particles of metal, you're not reflecting the light the same way. The more you build up the metal particles, the more you'll get the shine and original color of the metal. But certainly, I don't know why this is, but for some reason, the pumice and the silica, maybe it's how it abrades the metal nib, but for some reason, it brings out more of the individual color of the different nibs. So that will help to increase your darks to some degree. Another little trick is you can rub carbon black onto a surface. This is bringing you into a different medium, of course. If you don't have a binder with it, it's not like you're painting with it, but there's a well-known artist out there who I believe this is one of the ways that deep darks are achieved, where if you take carbon black pigment, it's a very small particle size. It's about 0.5 microns. Whereas most pigments we work with are 1 to 5 or even 10 microns. So carbon black is about the smallest particle size pigment you can work with. And it will rub into that high PVC surface of metal point, and then you can draw on top of that carbon black. And that too would expand your value range, admittedly, by introducing another medium. And then the final thing, of course, is adding white heightening to a drawing. If you work on a toned or tinted ground and develop your metal marks, then at the end you can start to bring out the highlights using pretty much any white medium. It could be chalk or colored pencil or egg tempera or gouache or whatever you want to start to bring out the white highlights. So those are a few ideas.
There's this question about what is the best surface for metal point.
$100,000 question.
Yes,
I thought we explained, and every artist is so different. So then,
Yeah. Well, it's a great question because, and it's one of the joys, but initially one of the confounding things about metal point is because of the variety. And as I said in my interview, you can take almost any binder. I think the one exception, and George, you can jump in here if it's wrong. I think wax would not make a good binder for a metal point ground because the wax never fully hardens and it can't have the high pigment load necessary.
It's too soft.
Yeah, too soft. But almost any other binder, you could oil, egg yolk, gum arabic, casein, a polymer, a vinyl or acrylic polymer, any of those, you are able, with a certain amount of care, you raise the pigment load sufficiently. It's either an inherently a high PVC paint like casein or egg temper, or you raise the pigment load safely, not to so much that the ground becomes fragile, but there's tests for that. But anyhow, so that you get that effect. And it can be a metal point ground. I found an oil ground with a high PVC worked fabulous for metal point. It took a long time for the oil to cure, so it's not a ground for the impatient, but so any ground, and then the ground gives you your support. Paper boards, wood-based panels, all those work if the ground is compatible with that support. So, for example, if you're working with a traditional metal point ground made with rabbit skin glue and an animal glue and a very high PVC, that's a fragile ground. You can't put too many of those on paper because it could crack. Then you're back to a rigid support. But if you're doing a single wash of a zinc gouache, which works fantastic as a metal point ground, put it on any paper you want. Heavyweight, lesser weight papers. Generally, most metal point artists want a hot press paper because they want the smoothness so the nib doesn't skip or jump. But you can do it on a rough cold press paper too, if you like the skippy, jumpy nib mark. So it depends on your goals and your visual goals and your nature. I like the artist saying that he likes paper. I like rigid supports. Everybody's different. And that's one of the fantastic things about metal point. It's a little confounding at first because you have to kind of know what you're shooting for, but it can suit almost any nature and any visual goal.
I was thinking about when we talk about all kind of oil colors or watercolors, the range of the colors, and you think when we talk about with artists, and you kind of understand what one likes one thing, another one. Here's metal point, and I thought gray is gray, and
I know.
Whoosh. So
yeah. Never mind working on black grounds, and the variety is overwhelming. It's very exciting.
In a full interview, please check Koo's images there. So George and Koo talking about this incredible image on black surface. So that would be great. So I'm so sorry we cut that out.
No, you guys did a great job. No worries.
So here's a question, of course, just talking about grounds and a black ground. And I know, Koo, you've done this. Maybe you can answer that question about gold point on black grounds.
Sure. It's very hard to make a black ground yourself because the fillers that most people use to make a gesso are white. So you have to get special fillers that are transparent. But there's plenty of great black grounds on the market. Or you could use a black paint that has a high PVC. So Golden's gesso, they make a black ground that works well. There's black casein paint, black oil paint. So I hope that distinction's clear. Paint is primarily pigments, so just have all black pigments and just raise the pigment load, and that gives you your black ground. Or if you're going to work with an actual ground like a gesso, you probably have to buy it commercially prepared because most artists don't have the fillers to make a truly black ground. You'd get a gray ground. But working on a black ground is exciting. It's challenging because the tonal range is even more limited. But the benefit of that is that
as I said, the pumice and the silica seem to bring out more color in the marks. And before I forget, let me say, always wear a mask with these additives, these fillers you put in, particular things like silica, which are clearly not good to breathe in. But yeah, so just as those additives can bring out the color of a mark, black gesso, black grounds really bring out the coloration in metal point nibs. And in the thing that Tanya was just talking about, that's in the full-length interview, a drawing I did on black gesso, the entire bird, it's an oriole, and the orange and yellow and rust in his breast is entirely made with gold and brass and copper points. And that becomes more apparent, as I say, on a black ground. And Susan Schwab, she's a very well-known metal point artist. She and Tom Mazzullo wrote a fantastic book on metal point. And Susan specializes in abstract images on black grounds where the coloration of the nib shows through. So that's CHWALB. I hope that got that right, Susan. And if you look up her images, you'll see the possibility for bringing out enormous coloration on a black ground.
One time, quite some time ago, we went to opening of Susan.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. I mean, we're talking about, you know, like reproduction. And when we went live, it just blew my mind. It's just completely changed my idea about silver points. And so
that's great.
You guys need to check that artist too.
Just to continue the discussion about grounds, I know you mentioned about zinc, and Lori has a question about zinc and, of course, oil grounds. And does this extend to water-based medium? So they're cracking in oil, in zinc oil paintings.
Well, George, you're probably better able to answer that. I just want to say that it's important. Lori's an experienced artist, silver point artist, metal point artist. For people to distinguish, it can get confusing because you can work with a zinc nib, which is a metal wire, or you can add the pigment zinc to your ground. And those are two distinct things. So just first make that distinction when we're talking about a zinc point. In the image Tanya showed where the zinc had faded, that was a zinc metal nib drawn across a ground, not zinc pigment added to a ground. But you can add zinc pigment to a ground. George, go ahead and take that away about how that affects, you know more about that.
Right. So the issue is with zinc white in oil paint and oil grounds only. It does not extend to any water-based medium. So we just want to make that very clear. And so adding zinc into a glue ground, into a gouache ground, or any one of these types of water-based grounds, no problem. And in fact, as you mentioned, Koo, and I know some other artists have found that zinc does also does a wonderful job in abrading the tips.
Yeah.
So let's go on to another question. Let me see here. Oh yes, I'll add this one from Michele. Have you experimented adding color on top of the ground, not within the ground, and how would that work with silver point?
This is a great question because it can be very helpful for a beginner. Working on a tinted ground, as I said, is kind of magical because you have this fairly limited value range and your drawing can be lovely and elegant and exquisite. But boy, when you add those highlights with whitening, it suddenly gets very exciting. So tinted grounds are fantastic. Couple of tips. Don't make the tint too dark because most metal point, if you have a value scale of 0 to 10, let's say, with 0 being black and 10 being white, there's always exceptions, but most metal point marks hang out in the 7 to 3 range or something like that, or 2 range, or probably not that dark. But anyhow, so if you tint your ground too dark, you're not going to see your marks at all. So first keep the tint very light, generally speaking, with some exceptions. The other thing is it generally is better, depending on how many ground layers you develop, to tint the ground itself and not apply it on top. And the reason is there's a couple of reasons.
One is as you work away on the drawing with your nib and you just scratch, just line after line after line. If you start to disrupt the surface at any point, you can scratch through that color and suddenly you're competing with the white ground underneath, and that can be a problem to have to deal with that. The other thing is what I was talking about in my interview with erasing. One of the benefits, you can have a metal point ground that's a single layer or 2 layers of a zinc wash. It doesn't have to be a highly developed ground. My preference is for grounds that you can build up in multiple layers. And if you haven't tinted the ground throughout and you just apply the tint on top and you go to sand the ground to get it smooth, or you go to sand part of the drawing to slightly erase, you're going to see a different color underneath. So having a really consistently tinted ground, if you're going to build it in multiple layers, is important to do. Having said that, I often do mixed media in my metal points, and the one that Tanya spoke about earlier, the Oriole, that started as a black gesso, and the blacks in the Oriole are from the gesso. But at the end, I did sponge on a layer of color behind the Oriole with egg tempera paint, Prussian blue, to kind of enhance the cool of the Prussian, enhance the warmth of the bird's breast. So I did paint on top. But in terms of first preparing a ground, tinting it, and then drawing on top, I would always choose to tint the entire ground.
Great.
And the tinting ground, we can do with...
Woohoo, dispersions.
Dispersions. If you don't like pigments, although you still use most the pigments, not dispersions are not working for you very well. Yes, is that?
Well, in egg tempera, I make my own pigment paste. I always work in paste form. I'm a big advocate for being careful with the dust. So I always work with pigment paste and I make my own for the most part, except for very small particle size, hard to disperse colors like quinacridone or Prussian. But to tint a drawing, I really recommend, if you're going to work with any small particle size or modern colors to tint, work with a commercial dispersion. It's just too hard to fully disperse anything that's less than about a micron size, and you'll get streaks, particularly if you develop a multiple layer ground and you go to sand the ground and you run into a little clump of Prussian blue, you're going to get a streak of Prussian. So, but if you work with earth pigments to tint, and earth pigments tint beautifully, they're nicely controlled, and they increase abrasion for the most part because they're rough, irregular morphologies, shapes. They're fairly large particle size, and they're fairly hard. So tinting with earth pigments works beautifully, and because of their larger particle size, they disperse fairly readily. So I don't think you need to do an earth dispersion per se to tint a ground. I think you would want to first get the powdered pigment with a palette knife, disperse it by hand on a palette, and then add it into your ground to get the dispersion. But I think you could do that by hand. And this has made me think of one more thing, as is my way, talking about the importance of tooth and that bit of the ground. Understand that there's a point at which too much tooth isn't useful. And George and I have talked about this. When you have too toothy of a ground, in fact, the metal nib abrades too large particles and inconsistently, and the metal doesn't attach as well. So there is, while a metal point ground absolutely needs this microscopic irregular tooth, don't go to the point of thinking, oh, great, the larger the tooth, the darker the mark or something. No, that at some point, if the ground is too rough, like visibly rough sandpaper, it doesn't hold or make as dark or consistent or durable of a mark.
Do you burnish afterwards or not? Or it's
no. I don't, and everybody's different, but some people talk about burnishing the metal point ground, and this is the trade-off, is that the smoother the surface that you're drawing on, the more perfectly fine the line is and consistent. But if you burnish too much, you can start to knock back the tooth, and then you won't get as much abrasion. So I like a perfectly smooth in terms of no visible striations in the gesso, but I like it microscopically rough. So I don't go more than I'd say like a 280 grit sandpaper. I'm not looking for an ivory piano key, because at that point, your marks don't abrade and don't attach as well. And I think that can be some of the problem with some of these perfectly smooth mineral and sulfite papers, is they're so smooth and they make a gorgeous line. But I've heard stories of quite a few of drawings disappearing. And I think it's because they are lacking enough microscopic tooth to hold on to the metal deposits as well. That's my guess. But
what about like burnishing the drawing, like in gilding, when we are burnishing the, like specific lines? And so is there practice of that?
I'm going to try it, Tanya. I don't know. You've given me another distraction in the studio. Thank you. My guess is that you could end up abrading or lifting. The problem with metal point doing these tests is that there's so many grounds. There's so many supports that it's hard to do one test and say this is definitive. So in some circumstances that might work, and in some it might not. And if anybody out there has any experience with this, I'm sure all three of us would be really interested in hearing.
Yeah. Because see, like when in gilding, what we are doing, so when we make a shell gold, so we are taking this burnisher, and so the specific lines, and so then where it's burnished, where it's not burnished, and I thought like maybe you had.
Okay, we're going to try it.
Okay,
but okay, Tanya. Here, now that I'm thinking about it, so to some degree, you end up burnishing the surface by the action of drawing, and And that is actually the problem at some point. Everybody out there who's a metal point artist knows that as you start to reach for that darker mark, the temptation to press harder is irresistible. But all you're doing at that point is you're not abrading more off the nib. You're just starting to work down your high PVC toothy surface until the point where it's not abrasive anymore. And so if you burnish a ground too much during the drawing process by the mere act of drawing, you will stop abrading your nib. Whether you could do that at the end or whether you don't need to because your drawing has kind of done it for you. If that happens, if there's metal point artists out there who struggle with that, who find they have the habit of abrading their surface to the point where they can't dislodge any more metal, then that idea that both Erin and I talked about scumbling on top, where you reinstate the ground very, 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 very thinly so you don't bury your drawing. That's one way to start to reinstate abrasion.
Got it. Thank you.
We have maybe just, this is an interesting question from Eileen Kennedy. And she talks about her process of building darks. And she also mentions that that initially the ground is resistant to further marks. But after a while, she asked the question is that it will take it after if she waits a little bit of time. Is this because that area has begun to oxidize, in essence, creating its own tooth? And I think there's a little bit of confusion in that terminology, but maybe you can answer or speak to that a little bit.
Well, hi, Eileen. Eileen's a fantastic metal point artist. She just posted a gorgeous image on her Instagram page of a beautiful silver point drawing where she's getting very wonderful deep darks. And Eileen, I don't know. It's an interesting thing. I have that both with egg tempera and with metal point, that the surface seems to get tired of being worked, tired of us at the end of the day. And you let it sit and you come back and the next day it seems more welcoming. And I don't know, George, what do you think? It doesn't quite make sense to me that oxidation would increase the tooth in the ground. I'd have to think about it, Eileen. Do you have any thoughts, George?
I don't think it would necessarily increase the tooth, but certainly the oxidation is a change. It would actually change the particles to some degree, and maybe just like when you see rust. Of course, this oxidation is not the same thing as rust, but just as you see rust starts to, you can take a shiny piece of metal, starts to rust, and you see the surface becomes very matte. And but this is a slightly different process. So. We recently purchased a high-powered microscope in our lab, and so this is something that we can start taking a look at.
All right. Yeah, I mean, I could imagine. It's fascinating what's happening is that, metals corrode through air, through moisture, through sulfides, through a million different chemicals compel metals to corrode. And so the patina is a reaction, the metal's trying to protect itself by forming this layer. And so maybe the particles are forming and they have a different particle size, morphology. I don't know. So get that microscope and let us know.
And let me see. Here's an interesting question, because I'm sure people will ask about it, and that is there a transparent silver point ground recipe?
Yeah, this is great. So when I was doing this thing where I was scumbling over my drawings to reinstate abrasion, I like that I was using, I used the tempera ground quite a bit to do this. And I didn't mind that it also put a little bit of white, because those scumbles over images, they unify brush, drawing marks, they create more unity and atmosphere, they impart all sorts of things, a layer of white. But I did reach a point where I was like, well, I want more abrasion, but I don't want to keep covering my drawing. And so I experimented with some matte medium and adding abrasive particles to that. And I actually did some experimenting with the Golden's team. That team, Golden Artist Colors has a fantastic team of techs. And I asked them about, could I do this with a matte medium? And they did, I'll send you an image of this, George, a demo panel where they tried different of their transparent matte mediums combined with abrasive elements like silica and, chalk and things to use for me as a scumbling agent over images. But I think you probably could use that as a transparent ground. Does that make sense to you, George?
It does. It's because of the fillers, it's not going to be as water clear or water white transparent, and it's going to be translucent at best. It will depend on the actual fillers used and the refractive index.
Very good point.
Between the medium and of course the fillers. And we could probably get close, but it'll probably have to get with something like ground glass, and I'm not sure how that would work, if that would work very well at all. But
I have tried powdered glass as an additive for abrasion, but as you know perfectly well, George, that even powdered glass cannot be perfectly translucent depending on the grind. And this is important for people to understand that this is the classic example that chalk added to oil paint is transparent because it's fully surrounded by paint. But once chalk is in the medium, so to speak, of air, it's opaque white. And the very fact that all metal point grounds are high PVC with these pigment particles that protrude above the surface of the binder means that you'd have to start with a 100% transparent filler, not one that just happens to be transparent when surrounded by binder, because in a high PVC surface, the particles aren't fully surrounded by binders. So that would be the trick to get a truly transparent particle.
Right.
Yeah.
So
one more, I guess, and maybe we'll have to stop here. Yes. Lori adds she's used.
We're just getting to go.
We can do all day. Yes. I know that.
Lori adds that she tried a Williamsburg pastel ground, which is a matte medium, and it worked great. So that might be a little suggestion there as someone working on that. And I think, I think we'll conclude this. And very importantly, we had a question: does Koo teach any classes? Of course she does.
That's what I was saying. Then I want
so
to
maybe
finish
Koo, you
with
could
that.
do a little plug, and we'll actually put a link to your website below the YouTube video. But maybe you could talk just about what your classes are.
Yeah, I do teach workshops. I teach 4 or 5 workshops a year, mostly at tempera. But I do have a metal point class that I teach every year. I'm teaching it at my studio in September. It's very comprehensive. The first day we make 4 different grounds on 4 different supports. I go over additives. You have a choice to include additives in the ground to increase abrasion. I bring about 30 different metal nibs. Yes, I have that many metal nibs. It comes with a complete metal point kit that you get to take home, including 3 different nibs and a bunch of papers and grounds that you've made in class. So I teach that, and I teach a traditional painting design or traditional old master imagery design course. So all that's on my website, and clearly I love to share these mediums, and everybody's welcome to come.
And of course, you have tempera classes too, yes?
Yeah, I have 3 temper classes this year, and all levels are welcome, and we go into depth. It's a lot of fun. So
And it's
obviously,
live. I mean, it's
In person.
in person.
in person. Yeah, I do have one online course that I taught and will be available on an ongoing basis in February. Produced by Acorn Arts. You can find that on my website. But mostly I love to teach in person. The classes are fairly small. They're very one-on-one. So, it's one of my great pleasures as a painter is to teach.
Great. Thank you, Koo. Thank you very much. And
You're so welcome.
Thank you, Koo.
and so I actually thank all our artists, and so I apologize to cutting all your interviews, but it will be available right after when we finish this session, and you can watch full links. And so thank you guys being with us, and so now we know it's success, and so then we probably will bring more artists, and Koo, you will be first on our tempera session.
We'll have to make it 6 hours.
Yeah, let's do it. Thank you very much. Right. Have a great day, and see you next month. I don't even know what's the date will be. We will announce again. And thank you very much. See you next time.
Bye now.
Bye.